Hello everyone, welcome to my presentation on male experiences of female perpetrated intimate partner violence. Thank you for taking the time to stop by my booth, and I hope you enjoy this presentation. To begin, I'd like to start with the presentation outline. So I'm going to start with some background and important definitions, then move into research questions and methods, and finally talk about the findings and implications from this study. So, intimate partner violence is defined as any abusive act or conduct in physical, psychosocial, or sexual conduct between adults in an intimate relationship. Now, this is a complex phenomenon that is often understood with women as the primary recipients of violence and men as the primary perpetrators. However, there is emerging research suggesting men also experience violence, but their experience are downplayed due to gendered understandings of this violent experience. So to start with a quantitative assessment, according to a Statistics Canada report on police reported cases of IPV in 2018, 4.2% of men and 3.5% of women experienced violence from their partners. Now, according to the same study, 20.7% of men self-report those cases to the police compared to 79.3% of women. So why do we see this large disparity between male reporting and female reporting if they experience similar rates of abuse? Well, it's actually not due to the severity, but due to some other important issues. And we're going to talk about that in this literature overview. So to begin with the constructions of violence. In society, we have a dominant idea that women do not abuse men. When we do see experiences of women abusing men, that abuse is often viewed as less harmful when directed at men compared to the same behavior directed from a man towards women. And these perceptions that IPV-related services are only for women are a barrier to men engaging in help-seeking behaviors like with the police or other IPV-related services. Next, we have constructions of masculinity and gender. So there's power in relation to gender, where men are commonly viewed to have power in their relationships and power over their female partner. When we flip that role and the woman is the perpetrator in the relationship, that power dynamic goes against the social ideas that we're very comfortable with. There's also traditional masculine ideas, where men are assumed to be strong, tough, and not vulnerable to abuse, and also not supposed to show harm and strong emotions. Men fear that they'll be deemed unmanly when they violate these traditional masculine ideals, making them generally hesitant to engage in help seeking for their experiences of abuse. We also have social services barriers. So police services can sometimes cause mistrust and re-victimization when they're engaging with male survivors due to a lack of understanding of male experiences of abuse. IPV-related services can also sometimes disregard male experiences of violence because they're predominantly used to working with female survivors. And judicial services are often perceived as unlikely to award men custody of their children by these male survivors, making them unlikely to engage in any form of help seeking with those judicial services. So when we combine all these barriers, we see why men are unlikely to engage in help seeking at police services or other forms of help seeking behaviors in general. So I had three primary research questions. First, what are the lived experiences of service providers who work with male survivors of IPV? Second, how does the intersection between gender and masculinity influence the experiences of both the men and their providers? And third, how do providers navigate the dominant perspectives of violence when caring for these men? I decided to focus on service providers for this study because while there is emerging research on male survivors, there is virtually no literature that examines the perspectives of their providers, despite the fact that they may have very important things to add to this discourse. This study was qualitative in design and it used a narrative inquiry methodology. For sampling, it began as purposive sampling and then moved into snowball sampling to recruit further participants. I ended up with a total of 4 participants that each underwent semi-structured interviews over Zoom, and the entire study and data collection was conducted in a digital nature. For data analysis, the data was transcribed in Microsoft Word, and then an inductive thematic analysis was completed in Quarkos, and you can see the example from Quarkos in this image to the right, showing how that data analysis looked and some of the categories that emerged through this inductive analysis. Now, I'd like to start talking about some of the primary findings that emerged from this study. All the themes are based on the provider's experiences caring for male survivors and their perceptions of these social values in society. So to start, I want to talk about some of these social perspectives of IPV and the social constructions of what violence looks like. I will use participant quotations, so beginning with the first one. Men are assumed to have more power than women in a patriarchal view of society. How is it then that men can truly be victims, particularly at the hands of women? So I think it's hard for people to come to grips with the reality that violence doesn't always have a gender focus. So this general theme that male victimization challenges the dominant ideas of violence, gender, and power in our society. Terminology around violence often includes battered women and violence against women because historically the rates of reported abuse for women have been much higher. However, when media representations and advertisements focus on these aspects of female victimization and ignore male victimization, it makes it difficult for people to really see that men can be survivors of abuse. For the second quotation, we're just barely scratching the surface on connecting with men who are in abusive situations. It's really difficult to connect with them because of the socialization of the issue, the social perception of the issue. So there's a general lack of awareness on men's experience of violence, which makes it difficult for them to know where to seek help. There's very few services directed specifically at men, and they're hard to locate. So when we look at all those social and structural barriers that we discussed previously in the literature review, we see why it's difficult for men to come forward, especially in relation to these quotations displayed under this theme. The second theme is a prevalent theme that emerged centered around men in society upholding the dominant ideas of masculinity and gender, and how men who are experiencing abuse construct their own masculinity in relation to these issues. Men are supposed to be tough, they're supposed to avoid vulnerable emotions, and they're supposed to have power and control in their relationships, or so traditional masculine ideologies tell us. So to begin with the first participant quote, one of the assumptions that people make is that even if a woman is physically hitting or abusing a man, the man should just take it. He is bigger, stronger, and it's probably not that big of a deal. No harm done, right? Just a little thing. So these social constructions of gender and masculinity create a perception that men shouldn't be capable of being seriously harmed by a woman. They're just supposed to brush it off, and it's not supposed to do that much harm. And this is centered on men denying that they're experiencing harm from a woman, whether that abuse is actually harmful to them or not. They don't want to admit it. Quote number 2. I've had people, because I'm pretty vocal on this, I've had people come up to me and say, I too was abused. I don't want to tell anybody, but this happened to me. I mean, it's a lot. So, I think the stigma about being judged is a huge barrier to disclosure. Female perpetrated violence in heterosexual relationships violates notions of masculinity that men often compare themselves to, even subconsciously. This generally causes men to feel emasculated for being abused by a woman when they're supposed to be tough and live up to those ideas that I've mentioned before. So male survivors end up feeling like there's a stigma around being abused by their partner, which makes them hesitant to mention it to anybody. And that stigma is a huge barrier to disclosure, both informally, through family and friends, or formally at judicial services, justice services, or other IPV-related organizations that are there to help survivors of abuse. And for the third quote, I know that I became a caricature of what I thought a man should be based on my life. That may not be true of all lives. Again, I don't know, but I'm suspecting in one form or another it's because of the fear of being judged or seen as different. Now, this participant had personal experience of abuse, which he gave his explicit permission to disclose. Intense feelings of shame are generally associated with not living up to these ideal man ideas in society. Men expend a large amount of energy to keep their abuses secret from their peers, and they often become more isolated out of fear that others will find out. This results in a loss of self-identity and a loss of confidence, generally because they're worried as being seen as different or judged if they do speak out about their experiences and the re-victimization that that might bring. Lastly, the last theme that I'm going to highlight is male survivors often struggle to recognize their experiences of abuse and remain silent about these experiences. This stems from the social constructions of violence, gender, and masculinity that I've discussed previously. So for the first quote, they don't identify with the words violence or even abuse. They don't even identify with the words abuse. So men struggle to recognize their experiences, violence or abuse, even when they're engaging in help seeking because of these social constructions of what IPV looks like. It's very ingrained in their understanding of violence in relationships. And when we use screening terminology like have you been abused, it's not effective and instead needs to be focused on behavior-centered approaches like has your partner ever hit you or has your partner ever scratched you or demeaned you in order to get men to really recognize their experiences of violence. The second quote, male survivors are aware that something feels bad, but they rarely conceive that they are being abused. So for this quote, most of the men who come into our program do not identify as having been in an abusive relationship. There's a narrative that only women can be victims and men are perpetrators, and that it's so metabolized in everybody's consciousness that men who are in an abusive relationship know that it feels really bad, but they don't conceive that they're being abused. So, like I said, they rarely conceive that they're being abused in these relationships because they have few examples to compare their experiences to help them recognize what they're experiencing really is that violent. Realization occurs when others in their peer support programs share their experiences, and through a common understanding, they can begin to see and recognize that they're experiencing an abusive relationship and start to engage in a process of recovery. For the third quote, I think that, well, once you're abused, you kind of go into a club of thinking you're the only one. I know when I was abused, I thought I was the only one until years later when I started talking about it. Now, men are unlikely to share their experiences within social circles due to feelings of shame and judgment. Across interviews, men began to feel like they're the only man experiencing these events and these feelings, as exemplified by this participant who had personal experiences of violence. This lack of representation makes them feel like they're the only one, reinforcing their desire to remain silent. Many men also experience re-victimization when disclosing their experiences, making them hesitant to try again. So, there's two primary recommendations that I'd like to talk about. First, we need to increase knowledge, translation, and implementation of research in IPV-related services. So we need to specify phrasing of IPV to be more inclusive on many websites of male survivors' experiences because oftentimes it only represents female survivors. We need more gender-inclusive IPV services in general that are advertising services for men and not solely for women. More information distributed to providers on where to refer men would also help if their organization doesn't already have those systems in place to aid male survivors. Secondly, we need to generate advocacy and awareness surrounding male experiences of IPV to reduce feelings of shame and isolation. The best thing that we can do is talk about it. So general awareness can make men feel less isolated and help them come forward to engage in help-seeking behaviors and reduce those feelings of stigma. It can also help men recognize that they too can be hurt from violence in heterosexual relationships. If you're interested in reading more about these types of issues, here's some references on the screen that were used in this presentation. Thank you very much for your time. If you have any questions about this study or about my research in general, please feel free to send me an email. Take care.